picture this scenario. You are sitting in a high-stakes job interview, or maybe you're standing at the front of a boardroom.
Right. Sweating a little bit.
Exactly. And you are asked a complex question in English. Now, you know the answer. You understand the concepts perfectly.
But your mind just goes completely blank.
Completely blank. You freeze. Your heart is racing. You're frantically searching your brain for the vocabulary, but
There's just static.
just static. We have all experienced some version of this, and it is an incredibly frustrating, almost helpless feeling. So, welcome to today's deep dive.
It's great to be here.
Our mission today is to look completely past the standard, run-of-the-mill tips and tricks for language learning. Instead, we are digging into a really fascinating stack of neuro-linguistic research and clinical studies.
We really want to uncover the actual neuroscience of language fluency.
Right. We're going to explore exactly why that frozen feeling happens to you, and more importantly, how you can physically rewire your brain to fix it.
And for anyone listening who has dealt with that sudden inability to speak, the very first thing to understand from our source material is that freezing is not a sign that you're bad at English.
Oh, that's such a relief to hear.
It really is. It's actually just a biological indicator of how that language is currently stored in your brain. You see, most learners treat language acquisition as an academic pursuit. They rely heavily on what we call declarative memory.
Which is the knowledge brain.
Exactly. It's the part of the brain responsible for storing explicit facts, things like historical dates, or in this case, grammar rules and vocabulary lists.
But the act of speaking in real time,
Is not a declarative function.
no, not at all.
It relies on procedural memory. That's your physical brain, the system that governs motor skills.
Okay, that is a huge distinction to make right out of the gate. So the frustration basically stems from learners testing themselves on written vocabulary,
Right, using that declarative memory.
passing those written tests, and then expecting that knowledge to just seamlessly translate into real-time physical speech.
That is the core disconnect. When you sit at a desk and memorize verb conjugations, you are effectively filling up a database in your cortex.
Right.
But producing spoken language requires incredibly precise split-second coordination. I'm talking about the lungs, the vocal cords, the jaw, the lips, the tongue.
It's a physical movement.
It is fundamentally a complex motor skill. And the neural pathways required for motor skills are built in an entirely different way than the pathways used for memorizing facts.
The sources really hammer this home by referring to the tongue as a muscle, which implies that speaking a new language is actually a lot closer to learning how to play the violin or shooting a basketball.
It's a near-perfect parallel. And this brings us to a major physiological hurdle for learners, which the research highlights by comparing different linguistic muscle sets.
Yeah, the comparative study between English and Turkish in the sources illustrates this beautifully.
It really does. So a native Turkish speaker has spent their entire life training the muscles in their mouth to execute a very specific, highly efficient set of movements. Their motor cortex is completely optimized for Turkish phonetics.
But English demands physical movements that simply do not exist in that Turkish muscle set.
Exactly.
And the research points to the sound, like in the words think or thought, as a prime example of this barrier.
Yes, the interdental fricative.
What?
The interdental fricative, that's the technical term. In languages like Turkish, there is no phonetic requirement for the tongue to be placed between the upper and lower teeth while exhaling.
Right, they just never have to make that shape.
Never. Because that specific motor pattern has never been established, asking the tongue to perform it for the very first time feels physically clumsy.
I can imagine.
It's exhausting for the learner because they're demanding a brand new coordinated movement from muscles that are deeply, deeply conditioned to do something else.
And the natural biological response to that exhaustion is for the brain to look for a shortcut. The sources note that learners will frequently substitute sink or tank for think because their declarative memory knows perfectly well how the word is spelled and what it means.
But the procedural memory just falls back on the closest familiar physical movement.
Wow. But that raises an interesting question. If a learner is constantly substituting sink for think because it's easier, aren't they just hardwiring a bad habit?
They are, which is exactly why passive studying is completely insufficient. To correct this, the learner has to engage in intentional, physically accurate repetitions. The literature often refers to this approach as treating your practice like a mouth gym.
A mouth gym. I love that.
You are no longer studying vocabulary. You are physically training your anatomy. It requires conscious, slow repetition of the correct mouth placement until the motor cortex maps the new movement and it becomes an automatic reflex.
Okay, so if we're treating the mouth like a gem, I want to understand the underlying biology of what those repetitions are actually achieving inside the skull. Because the research spends a considerable amount of time discussing the physical changes in the brain's white matter, specifically focusing on a substance called myelin.
Myelin is absolutely central to the neuroscience of fluency. Here's how it works. Every time you think a thought, recall a word, or execute a mouth movement, an electrical signal fires across a pathway of neurons in your brain.
Okay.
When you are learning a completely new motor skill, that initial neural pathway is basically bare. The electrical signal travels relatively slowly, and it can easily dissipate or get interrupted.
Right.
However, as you repeat that specific movement or phrase, your nervous system responds by wrapping that neural pathway in a fatty protective tissue called myelin.
And the sources use a great analogy here, comparing myelin to the rubber insulation you would find wrapped around a standard copper electrical wire.
It functions in almost the exact same way. In an electrical system, thick insulation prevents the current from leaking out, right?
Right, it keeps the charge contained.
Yeah. Exactly, which allows the signal to travel faster and more efficiently from point A to point B. In the human brain, the principle of neuroplasticity dictates the exact same outcome. The thicker the myelin sheath wrapping the neuron, the faster and more robust the electrical signal becomes.
So bringing that back to language learning, if you only encounter a new vocabulary word once or twice while reading a book, your brain doesn't receive enough stimulus to generate any meaningful myelin.
The signal remains weak.
But if you practice speaking that word 50 times out loud in various sentences, you are actively thickening that biological insulation. You're paving a brain highway.
You're building a high-speed fiber optic cable. That is the physiological reality of practice. You are fundamentally upgrading the physical infrastructure of your brain.
That's incredible.
So when a student struggles in a conversation and says, "Oh, I forgot the word," it is rarely a true failure of memory.
Because the data is still stored in their declarative memory.
Exactly. The actual issue is that the neural pathway connecting that stored information to the speech center just wasn't paved well enough. It wasn't myelinated. The electrical signal was simply too slow to be retrieved and articulated during the rapid pace of a live conversation.
That perfectly explains the phenomenon of completely freezing up. The signal just gets lost in transit.
Precisely.
But what about the intermediate learners? The ones who don't freeze entirely, but they speak with constant jarring pauses. You often hear learners expressing immense frustration that they sound like stop-and-go traffic, while native speakers seem to just flow effortlessly.
That stop-and-go rhythm is a classic symptom of cognitive overload.
Cognitive overload.
Yes. To understand this, we have to look at how much processing power the human brain has available at any given moment. When a beginner or intermediate speaker tries to construct a sentence in real time, they are usually building it completely from scratch.
Word by word.
Right. They are manually searching for the correct verb, then applying a grammatical tense, selecting the right preposition, and simultaneously trying to manage those unmyelinated physical mouth movements we just discussed.
It's too much. Yeah. The research draws a parallel here to a computer's CPU. If you try to run a computer with 100 different web browser windows open simultaneously.
The internal fan starts spinning?
Yeah, the fan spins, the battery drains, and the entire operating system just begins to lag. The system is overwhelmed by concurrent tasks.
The human brain operates under a very similar constraint. You simply do not have the conscious processing bandwidth to make dozens of micro decisions about grammar and pronunciation simultaneously without pausing to let the cognitive machinery catch up.
So what's the solution? How do we close those tabs?
The solution to this bottleneck, according to our sources, is a neurological process known as chunking.
Which is essentially the brain's way of compressing data to save processing power.
Correct. Through repetitive practice in that mouth gym, the brain stops treating a phrase like "I want to go" as 4 distinct labor-intensive words.
Okay.
Instead, the heavily myelinated neural pathway allows the brain to perceive and store "I want to go" as a single, unified block of information, one chunk.
Wow. That actually radically changes the definition of fluency. It implies that native speakers aren't actually thinking incredibly fast.
Oh, they aren't.
They just possess a massive, highly myelinated library of these pre-assembled chunks. They are just retrieving and assembling whole blocks of language, which completely eliminates those pauses.
That is exactly what the clinical data demonstrates. Native speakers are not constructing sentences from scratch in everyday conversation. They rely on deeply ingrained procedural memory to output these blocks, and the cognitive load drops to almost zero.
Okay, so we focused heavily on the output side of things, the motor skills and cognitive load required to speak. But fluency is obviously a two-way street.
Very true.
If our brains struggle with the processing power to output language, it stands to reason that a similar bottleneck happens with input. And our sources highlight a very widespread complaint among learners. They say they can read English proficiently, but when they listen to native speakers, the words seem to just blur together into one continuous, impenetrable wall of sound.
Yes, the wall of sound.
Hmm.
The mechanics of listening present an entirely different neurological challenge, and it is firmly rooted in linguistic rhythm. Linguists categorize languages based on their phonetic timing. English is classified as a stress-timed language. In contrast, languages like Turkish or French or Japanese are generally syllable-timed.
Let's clarify that distinction for our listeners. A syllable-timed language assigns roughly the same duration and emphasis to every single syllable, right? Creating a very steady, predictable pacing.
Right. The pacing is highly regular. It functions a lot like a metronome. Tick, 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 tick. But English rhythm is highly elastic and totally unpredictable to the untrained ear. In English, the core informational words, the primary nouns and verbs, are heavily stressed and stretched out. Meanwhile, the functional words, the pronouns, articles, prepositions, are squeezed, weakened, and rushed together.
The sources actually liken this elastic rhythm to a piece of music, where the melody constantly rises and falls and the tempo pushes and pulls.
Yes.
And if a learner's auditory system is strictly anticipating the steady, robotic beat of a syllable-timed language, they are going to completely lose the structural thread of the English sentence.
That musical analogy is incredibly apt. The
Yeah.
learner's brain literally needs to map the unique melodic structure or the shape of the new language. And this mapping occurs in a region called the auditory cortex.
Okay.
And just like building procedural memory for speaking, training the auditory cortex requires massive repeated exposure. When a learner repeatedly listens to English audiobooks, podcasts, or conversational dialogue, they are actively forcing their auditory cortex to identify boundaries between words that initially sound totally merged.
So the act of listening, even if the listener doesn't consciously understand every single vocabulary word, is still structurally modifying the brain.
Absolutely. The research compares this process to training your ear to appreciate a massive symphony orchestra.
Oh, I like this.
During your first exposure, your brain processes the orchestra as a single overwhelming wall of noise. You just hear a wall of sound.
Right.
But with repeated, attentive listening, the auditory cortex learns to isolate specific frequencies and patterns. Eventually, you can effortlessly distinguish the violins from the cellos and the woodwinds from the brass.
And in language learning, this same neurological adaptation allows you to stop frantically searching for individual textbook words and start recognizing the natural compressed patterns of native speech.
Precisely. You begin to hear the individual instruments, so to speak.
Okay, so that covers the biomechanics of speaking and the auditory processing of listening. But there's a huge psychological variable in our source material that we absolutely cannot ignore.
The confidence bridge.
Yes. Because a learner could theoretically build all the requisite myelin and train their auditory cortex perfectly. But if they are paralyzed by anxiety when a native speaker approaches them, all that physical infrastructure seems completely useless.
It does.
How does this neurological framework account for the fear of making mistakes?
The literature addresses this through a concept known as the affective filter. You can think of the affective filter as a psychological barrier regulated by the amygdala.
The fear center of the brain.
Exactly. When a learner experiences stress, anxiety, or the fear of negative evaluation, like during that high-stakes job interview we mentioned at the start, the amygdala triggers a stress response.
And what does that do?
This response actively impedes the prefrontal cortex, which significantly reduces the learner's ability to access their declarative memory.
Wow. So the anxiety literally blocks the brain from retrieving the grammar rules and vocabulary lists the learner spent hours studying.
It shuts the door.
The knowledge is in there,
Yeah.
but the stress response has just barricaded the door.
That is the precise biological mechanism of the freeze response. However, this is exactly where the transition from declarative memory to procedural memory becomes a vital defense mechanism.
How so?
Deeply ingrained procedural memory, those heavily myelinated motor skills we've been talking about, is far less susceptible to being blocked by the amygdala. Consider how a person can still ride a bicycle or physically run away from danger even when they are in a state of sheer panic.
Because the motor skill doesn't require conscious, calm deliberation.
Mm.
It's just an automated reflex.
Exactly. Therefore, by treating the mouth like a gym and physically practicing a phrase hundreds of times, the learner fundamentally bypasses the affective filter.
That makes so much sense. They aren't consciously hoping they remember the grammar rule. They are just executing a deeply hardwired physical movement. They feel safe.
That is the ultimate goal. The reliance on muscle memory removes the psychological burden of conscious translation, which naturally lowers the anxiety. And this mechanism leads directly to a phenomenon that many learners consider the absolute holy grail of fluency.
The ability to think in English.
Yes.
Our sources dedicate an entire section to this. And I have to ask, is thinking in a second language an entirely different cognitive process? Or is it just the logical endpoint of the myelination we've been discussing?
It is entirely a product of myelination and signal speed.
Really?
Yes. To visualize this, consider what happens when a bilingual learner looks at a common object, say an apple.
Okay.
The brain instantly fires an electrical signal to retrieve the corresponding word. Now, the neural pathway leading to their native language word has been utilized millions of times since childhood.
Right. It's an incredibly thick, high-speed superhighway.
Exactly. But initially, the pathway to the English word apple is just a faint, unpaved trail.
Naturally. So the electrical signal will always travel down the native superhighway first, prompting the learner to think of the word in their native language, and then they have to consciously translate it into English before speaking.
Exactly. But as the learner engages in high-frequency repetition and builds up the myelin on the English pathway, the signal speed on that specific route increases.
And eventually a biological tipping point is reached.
Yes. The English pathway becomes so heavily insulated and efficient that the electrical signal reaches the English vocabulary center faster than the native language center.
That is a profound shift in perspective. Thinking in English isn't some mystical state of mind. It is simply a matter of signal velocity.
It's pure physics in the brain.
The sources summarize this elegantly by stating the goal is to allow the native language pathway to become dusty through disuse in that specific context, while making the new English pathway shiny and optimized. When the English signal arrives first, you have effectively bypassed the brain's internal translation office.
That aligns perfectly with the clinical data. When you bypass that translation phase, you eliminate the cognitive load, you lower the affective filter, and you achieve what we all recognize as true fluency. Your procedural memory instantly outputs the sound without any conscious mediation.
We have mapped out a tremendous amount of neuroscience today, from transitioning out of declarative memory into the motor cortex, building myelin insulation, managing cognitive load through chunking, and training the auditory cortex.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. So to distill all of this complex biology into a practical application, what is the single most effective technique detailed in our sources that you, the listener, can implement today to start building these brain highways?
The consensus across the neurolinguistic research points to a highly specific physical training technique known as active shadowing.
Active shadowing.
Yes. If you want to force your brain to generate myelin and adapt your motor cortex, this is the protocol. The methodology requires taking a short 30-second audio or video clip of a native English speaker.
So this could be a professional broadcaster, an actor in a film, maybe a podcast host.
Any of those work perfectly. You listen to the clip and then you speak over it, attempting to replicate the speaker's delivery with absolute precision.
And the sources are very strict about the word precision here. It is not enough to simply repeat the vocabulary words. You must mimic the entire phonetic package.
Every single nuance must be replicated. You match their elastic rhythm, the exact stretching of the stressed words, and the rapid squeezing of the functional words.
You consciously mirror the physical shape of their mouth movements.
Crucially, you must also replicate their emotional tone and inflection, because tying emotion to the physical movement engages wider networks in the brain, which further solidifies the memory.
And you don't just do this once.
No,
Yeah.
You perform this shadowing exercise 10, 20, or 30 times in a row.
It is the literal equivalent of doing sets and reps at a physical gym.
Yeah.
You are intentionally stressing the neurological and muscular systems to force an adaptation.
Exactly.
Which brings up an important reality check from the sources. Consistency is vastly more important than intensity. You cannot expect biological tissue to adapt if you only shadow for 3 hours on a random Sunday and then do absolutely nothing for the rest of the month.
Biology requires sustained, repeated stimulus. You wouldn't expect to build visible muscle mass by visiting a weight room once a month, regardless of how hard you trained that single day.
Right.
The mouth gym operates by the exact same physiological rules. Fluency is a physical adaptation. You must supply the brain with consistent daily repetitions and allow the biological process of myelination to actually run its course.
Consistency drives the physical adaptation.
Wow. Well, we have covered an incredible amount of ground today, and I really hope this deep dive fundamentally shifts how you view your own language learning journey.
It's totally achievable.
It really is. It is not about raw intelligence or just studying harder. It is about recognizing the physical mechanics of the brain and training accordingly. But before we conclude, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over on your own.
Oh, this is a good one.
We have spent this deep dive exploring how language, something society traditionally frames as a purely academic intellectual pursuit, is actually deeply rooted in physical motor skills, white matter alteration, and muscular repetition.
It makes you wonder, what other persistent, seemingly intellectual struggles in your life are you currently trying to solve by simply thinking harder? Whether you are battling stage fright before a presentation, struggling to grasp a new programming language, or even trying to manage daily anxiety? What if those obstacles aren't mental or intellectual blocks at all? What if they are simply waiting for the exact right kind of physical, muscular repetition to finally click into place?
It's a powerful shift in perspective.
Something to consider. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive, and we will catch you next time.